Today's episode of the Binder Podcast is brought to you by the Columbia Museum of Art's 75th anniversary sponsors, including Masterpiece Mavens Melissa Blanchard and James Kirk Samsel, Art Angels sponsors Dominion Energy and Joyce Martin Hill, Cultural Champion sponsors Abacus Planning Group, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, Mr. and Mrs. David E. Dukes, First Citizens Bank, Quackenbush Architects and Planners, and Hannah and Ron Rogers. Thank you to them and all of our 75th anniversary sponsors. And now, let's start the show.
You're listening to Binder. I'm your host, Ray McManus. So we're here with Chadric Devin. Chadric is the new Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Columbia Museum of Art. Chadric, tell our listeners a little bit about what that is. What does that mean?
Well, thank you for having me on your podcast, first and foremost. Secondly, the Director of Learning and Engagement is a position at the museum that sort of oversees one of the larger divisions in the museum that incorporates three different departments. Our engagement department, which is often thinking critically about our community partnerships, our programs, our outreach. Our education department, which is thinking about ways in which we interact with the public, whether they be through public tours, school tours, outreach with educators. And then our visitor experience team, which has been described often as like the heartbeat of the museum. They're the people welcoming our guests in, helping people wayfind, have everything that they need to have an enjoyable, educational, meaningful experience. And it also includes our groups associated with the museum, the Friends of African American Art and Culture, the Contemporaries, the Columbia Design League, and then also our docent corps, which is a group of volunteers who I especially love because they're so dedicated to helping us, all from their own time, their own expertise. And so they bring a lot and add to the museum. So I've been tasked, with sort of helping sort of oversee and coordinate and collaborate with all these amazing individuals.
Yeah, so you are pretty busy.
Yeah. It definitely occupies a lot of my time, but it's something I'm really passionate about.
Sure, yeah.
I don't come from the museum world or museum work. And so this was a new jump in trajectory in my career. One that I'm not only happy for and excited about, but something that I feel called and compelled to do.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that, your career jump. What were you doing before?
Yeah, so I come from higher education. I was living and working in Nebraska over the last decade, mostly working in rural Nebraska at a community college. And so my background is as a studio artist, and so I was teaching a lot of studio art courses, drawing, painting, printmaking. I was also teaching a lot of our art and visual culture classes, so some of those lecture-based courses. But then I also had a role with our pre-service teacher education department there, where I was working with people who wanted to be educators, and all the things that sort of come along with training that next generation of teachers for our students. So that's sort of my background in terms of where I come from. People often ask me to describe myself in a bio. I use three different terms to describe myself: an artist, an educator, and a community collaborator. And the community part is really important for me because it really shapes how I've moved throughout and formed a path for me in the arts. Is that, no matter what I was doing, whether it was art making, advancing myself through various degree work, all the projects that I was busying myself with or that I found myself doing naturally was working with communities. So even in my time as a teacher, everything I was doing outside of the classroom was connecting with arts organizations, serving on boards, partnering with schools. I did a lot of work with museums in the Nebraska area and tried to find as many ways as I could to connect communities and students to art. And so I found that a lot of that work needed to happen outside of the classroom, which I guess is the long way of how I arrive at museums.
Yeah.
Is that I have sort of a special connection to what museums did for me, and how museums played a role in my path, in the ways that I could see other individuals finding their way to art through spaces like museums.
Man, you're singing my song, brother.
Oh,
Yeah,
great.
that's as one who is in higher education, but as also one who clearly museums and my relationship with museums shaped so much of my trajectory as an artist, and as one who sees the value and understanding of that collaboration with community. Because without that, who are we going to share great work with?
Well, it's very true, and access to art, it's a thing that I've thought about a lot, because I understand what a limited perspective and access to art felt like growing up. I'm
Right.
from rural Missouri.
I definitely would love to hear more about how limited those experiences were and how that shaped in what you want to what you're trying to do or what you'd like to be able to do with the museum now, because that is kind of a theme we've hit on several episodes. As one who grew up in rural South Carolina, there weren't any art museums over in Lexington County, really. And I didn't even get over here until I was in college. And then it was like, everything just opened up after that, just setting foot in this place.
Yeah, well, growing up in rural Missouri in the small town that I lived in, what people did was sports,
Mm-hmm.
arts, so they certainly weren't discouraged. My high school had opportunities to participate in the arts, but it was always seen as, extra,
Mm-hmm.
not essential.
Right.
And so although I grew up for a love in the arts, it wasn't until later in life when I was introduced to more opportunities and I had access to different spaces, whether it be through public spaces like museums or through institutional spaces like schools, where, the world of art and the ways that it could shape who I am as a person, how I see the world, how I see my place in it, all of that began to open because of the opportunities in those spaces. So although my experience the first time in a museum felt more intimate because it was just sort of me and a work of art, I recognize that even that has a power in and of itself, is
Right.
that art actually has the power to move you
Mm-hmm.
in and of itself. And then all the other things that spaces like museums, all the other people who are thinking about ways of engaging you add to that. Whether it be through programming or specialized tours or the ways in which somebody tasked with creating a better experience for you or helping you find your way through galleries or making sure you have all the tools that you need to enjoy your experience, those are the people who I work with here. And
Mm-hmm.
those are the people who are trying to think about everyone.
Right.
You don't have to be an art enthusiast to get something from this space.
Yeah.
And so that's the work that I get to do now that I love so much, is we get to think critically about how to make that happen.
Yeah. You're talking about access, and I think it would be rather appropriate for us to talk about one big focal point we have right now, right? Which
Sure.
of course is the Keith Haring Radiant Vision exhibit, and I think he is certainly an iconic artist and one that I think most people will recognize his work when they see it, because it's been around and it's been something that dare I say is accessible, primarily because, I mean, for a good portion of his career, it was very public. So we were talking about access, and maybe you could talk a little bit about Haring and his work and this exhibit. Like, you know what, I'll make it even easier.
Yes.
Is there a particular piece in this exhibit that you like, that just stands out to you, that sort
Mhm.
of emblematizes what he's all about?
So yes, there's an answer to that I know we'll get to, but I think I want to point back to some of the things that you were talking about in terms of why I feel Keith Haring will resonate is simply because, he was making work with this intention that art should be for everyone, which I feel is at the heart of what we're trying to do here at the CMA. And you are right to point out that his work is everywhere, and people notice it. They might not, like as you mentioned, recognize the name, but they certainly have seen his iconic imagery, his bold lines, his vibrant colors, these almost cartoonish but sort of energetic figures, the way that he uses symbols and icons, dynamic compositions. These are all the kinds of things that are drawing people to his work. It also has a commercial appeal to it to an extent that you will see, t-shirts, memorabilia, coffee mugs, calendars, pajamas. There's all sorts of things that
Yeah.
have walked through the doors of the museum with the excitement in the community around his work. So one of the things that we love is that we're able to actually put on display some of these works that they have seen maybe in public, but they haven't seen the depth and breadth of the kinds of things that encompassed his life and his work. Because although we see these energetic figures, people might not quite understand all the deep approaches and practices that meant a lot to Keith and his work in terms of how he interacted with communities, in terms of organizations that he partnered with, the activism in his work, and the various socio-cultural, political events happening, during the 1980s in the United States, and how that influenced his art, the ways that he tried to work outside of institutions, places that seem exclusionary. Although I love museums, in a very real way, museums have had to grapple with this idea that people don't feel like they belong in museums, which is part of the work that we're trying to do today. And so Keith Haring was working outside in many instances of those institutions.
Right.
And then as he's maneuvering through those spaces, of course, he gets notoriety, people notice him. Then all of a sudden he can kind of work in between those spaces in a really interesting way, knowing, okay, my art is connecting with people, right? Now, how do I use my art? Which is something that I think about, in my practice as a teacher. How do I teach students to think about art in that way, that art has not only a personal meaning, but like sort of a public meaning, and that it can do something, or it can speak about something, or fight for something. And so I think for me, people do resonate with that they see all aspects of his life in this museum, from sort of the beginnings of his career towards the end of his very short life. And maybe one of the reasons why some of his themes resonate so much with me is he's not so different from me. He grew up in rural Pennsylvania, working class family, looking for something bigger, something beyond what his hometown offered. I felt that way as a boy in Missouri.
Sure, absolutely.
What's new, what's out there for me, that brings him to New York, where he sees artists working outside of these institutions in the public. He was very much inspired by street culture, public art, often described as, graffiti, which has its own cultural traditions and histories and stereotypes around it. There were so many artists working in New York that he was inspired by, where he saw there's a way for my art to be public. There's a way that I can exist in this space, work amongst the people. I can have my art on display, and I can do that without necessarily having immediate access to these institutions who may or may not accept or reject me.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the very word institution conjures up a separation, right? I mean, it's a building that you have to go into. And when you're an artist out there in the public and you're presenting it for the people and connecting with the people, and the people don't need to go to the institution because the art is coming to them, that's a powerful connection.
Well, and I think that, from my perspective, that's one of the reasons why Keith probably had such an affinity for and was inspired so much by the artists working in public spaces in New York City. I think it's really important when we're thinking about the history of Keith Haring as an artist that, these ideas of working publicly don't just manifest themselves in him. There were a number of other artists already working in these spaces. Lee Quinones, Fab Five Freddy, Basquiat, Angel Ortiz, who artistically goes by LA2. We have some of his works in these exhibitions as well. There were Black, Latino, working class artists working in the streets, working inside of New York. And he saw that there was a way to express yourself outside of these institutions, and that communities connect with that. I mean, he was making art in subways,
Right, exactly.
Sort of hop off a train, draw as fast as you can. There was already these sort of like placeholders, I think like advertisement panels, they used to, like, whenever there wasn't an advertisement, there were these black sheets of paper in New York City at that time that they would have. And he would use something as simple as chalk to say, okay, how quickly can I make my work here when I hop off this train and then get on the next one before I get caught? Because at this time, I might argue that the sentiment hasn't changed, but there certainly was a sentiment at that time that anything not happening on a canvas or in a museum is sort of vandalism.
Right.
And that people, I think, still have that idea around ways in which, you have permission to make art in these spaces and in these places and on these things or not. And, I think he liked the idea that these artists, in a sense, cared more about the making and more about the ideas they were expressing than whether or not this was socially acceptable or legal.
Right.
And I think maybe he had a different strategy. He was actually pushing at it, saying, I'm going to use this thing that, like, how are you going to punish me? Because it's chalk. You can erase it. It's like
Right.
not permanent. I'm also like actually drawing on something that already exists. I'm not like drawing on this wall. So in a sense, he was sort of playing with this idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is something that is romantic and inspiring, and even noble when the artist really is only focused on the art and not anything else, and lets the art speak for the artist. Lets the art do what art does, whatever it is supposed to do. But there's an inherent danger to that, right? I mean, because of those words that I just used are also very abstract and can get very cliche. And with that, there's this danger that the more people who notice it, the more people who start to recognize it, it becomes almost commercialized. I guess what I'm trying to ask without saying the word, because I don't think that's what he's doing here, but is there an inherent risk of selling out?
I would argue that Keith Haring really leaned into it.
Okay.
As he was sort of amassing popularity and he saw commercial and inherent value in his work, he saw opportunity. He saw opportunity to have the public's attention in a way where they could grapple with some of the more serious content in his work. It's really easy to look at his figures, his symbols, his radiant babies, his barking dogs, and just kind of take them for face value. But the ways in which, Keith Haring is trying to use a visual language, to use symbols that mean something to him and put them in conversation with one another, he recognized that not only can my symbols have meanings and power based on how I arrange them, but that this popularity that I have, this attention that I'm getting, I can utilize them to talk on things that I think need to be advocated more, in a certain sense. He was very deeply and socially conscious and involved in HIV and the AIDS epidemic and awareness, anti-apartheid, anti-drugs. He was working with organizations like the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, referred to as ACT UP. You see his work in collaboration with the efforts of those groups because of that popularity. So for me, one might view an artist as selling out in terms of having a commercial appeal, but in a sense, for him, that was one of the access points to spreading awareness towards his initiatives. But also, he at some point was represented by galleries and making art for galleries. But then on the other hand, he understood, okay, well, now all the collectors are going to want to buy things. They have these large prices. Nobody's going to be able to afford my art. I'm going to create my own shop, a pop shop. The pop shop is what it was known as, where he had things at affordable, accessible prices. So everybody could own a Keith Haring if they wanted. We had some of the collectors of the exhibition, and they were talking about how people would come and he would just draw on their shirt, and then so it presented a dilemma, right? Because then he has a gallery down the street selling a work of art for an ungodly amount of money, and then here he is drawing on some teenager's shirt, and so of course the art market didn't like it, but I think that was part of his persona,
Right.
This idea that let me work outside of and within the institution. Some of the ways in which I connect with Keith are because I share those sentiments, that I recognize, especially in the trajectory of my career, that I've had to work within and outside of institutions to accomplish what I ultimately want to, which is why so much of my work took me into the community and not inside the classroom. And ultimately, it's one of the reasons why I sought opportunities outside of education, simply because I could see some of the limitations that classrooms present us with, some of the barriers that are there. Don't get me wrong, classrooms can be some of the most transformative spaces. But I think one of the things that I like about Keith Haring is that he inspires us to have a call towards something in the ways in which our art and our practice can connect with others outside of those spaces, if that makes sense.
No,
Okay.
absolutely. And I'm glad you said all of that because, I think, there's an intentionality, and that intentionality is to get it out to as many people as possible, to reach and connect to as many people as possible, to make it theirs as much as it is his. And that I think survives well past any career, right? I mean, as we see today, we've got this great exhibit. I'd love to hear what your impressions are of the exhibit, and then maybe if you could give a few takeaways that you think our listeners would want to pay attention to when they come in.
Well, first and foremost, I love the scope of the work in terms of that it kind of shows more or less a timeline of Keith's life from sort of the beginning ruminations of how he became Keith Haring, exploring public spaces, drawing and making marks quickly, integrating symbols into his approach, iconography that he develops, fancy way of saying signs and symbols of a language of his own, that might not necessarily be universal, but there's certainly things that we can read meaning into. The ways in which he engages critically with the world, politics, culture, society through his commercial work, through his partnerships, through his work with other age groups like children, the way in which he engages other artists. There's a whole gallery where he did a collaboration with William Burroughs.
Wow.
Sort of the Beat Generation,
Yeah,
of writers, a really powerful piece about the apocalypse, sort of after he was diagnosed with HIV, which is a really powerful thing to think about. What does it mean to make art when time is limited,
Right.
at that point in the 1980s? You grapple with that in this exhibition, that's also a part of his trajectory, that shapes who you are and what means the most to you. And then it sort of ends with this pop shop, which is for me kind of an enduring symbol of what it means to think about access to art, what it means to bring your art to people and provide entry points and pathways to your art where people feel like it can be a part of them. And so to me, I think that's what I connect the most with the show, is that through this collection of works, you're able to kind of see that trajectory and that story, if you will, being told.
Sure. You got any personal favorites? I know, right? It's like asking you, which kid do you like the best?
Works of art that mean a lot to you are sometimes the most difficult to articulate because you kind of want to say it in the most poetic way. But there is a giant image of a Medusa that's in the show that I think is probably the most powerful work to me. It's huge and it's monumental. It's actually facing across from the apocalypse work, which I described as one of these moments in Keith Haring's life, sort of after he's diagnosed with HIV. And this Medusa is kind of a work happening prior to that. It's not the traditional Medusa that you sort of see. There's no visible head, but what would be the snakes are sort of like these mangled and entangled bodies of people. And I just sort of think about this idea of watching the frailty of humans around you and the fragility of the human body and the ways that men around him were turning to stone. So really powerful work to sort of reflect on that moment.
Yeah.
And so I think when I connect with art the most is when art is sort of not just talking about what's happening, but a reality in which you see yourself in, and the ways in which people deeply involve who they are in their work, I think is probably, for me, some of the strongest work that I've connected with over my life and my career.
Chadric Devin is the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the CMA. The museum's latest exhibition, Keith Haring, Radiant Vision, is on view now through February 15th, 2026. Up next,
I was obsessed with Keith Haring when I was young, and it was because of how accessible his art was.
we get a visit from our neighbor from down the street, Ashley Warthen, after the break.
Ahoy, y'all! Producer Drew here, getting ready to ship off on a global adventure to Arts Unknown. But really, I'm just sitting here in my office. Because I can travel the world right here at the Columbia Museum of Art this January at the 75th Anniversary Gala. This is a travel-themed event to commemorate the grand unveiling of our newly reinstalled CMA collection galleries. Guests will be the first to see these galleries and journey through the museum's collecting pillars: Asia, Europe, the Americas, and modern and contemporary, discovering how global movements have influenced artistic evolution and how the CMA celebrates these legacies in dazzling new ways. Enjoy international and local cuisines inspired by the regions represented in our collection, and boogie to the funky sounds of the Root Doctors, while you immerse yourself in experiences that showcase both our regional roots and our global outlook. You won't need a plane, train, or cruise ticket, but you will need a ticket to the gala if you want to travel the world on January 16th at the Columbia Museum of Art. You can find more information and get tickets at columbiamuseum.org. Until then, bon voyage, and I'll see you on January 16 at the 75th Anniversary Gala. Now, back to the show.
My name is Ashley Warthen. I am the arts coordinator at Richland Library.
It's a great pleasure today to have you in the studio, Ashley. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, I think the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to talk about what an arts librarian is, because this sounds like this is the awesome best of both worlds kind of thing.
It kind of is. And I don't think there are very many of us in the country, or at least in the Southeast anyway. So it was a position that was created since I've been at the library. I've been there 16 years. What I do is everything arts related. I work a lot with the arts community. I curate our gallery space. We have an artist in residence program, and I help run that and do programming with them and all the things associated with that. And I work with my co-partner, I guess, Lee Snellgrove. We work together on all the art stuff. So it is as good as it sounds.
Yeah.
I work in a great place, but just doing art things. So
Right. Well, it is a great place. I will say just how small a world it is. So this is going to be wild. So 25 years ago, not like to the day, but not far from it, if I could remember what day that was. But 25 years ago, I had started a program called Split Piece Soup. And it was a poetry outreach program, workshop, really on Sunday afternoons for basically teenagers to come and write poems, write poetry and stuff. And we did that at, back then it was called the Richland County Public Library.
yeah,
With
RCPL.
RCPL. And I believe there was a children's librarian. Her name was Kathy Balknight. And she and I kind of put this thing together. And from that fateful experience, Split Pea Soup is still going today.
Really?
Yep, it's still going at the university. So
That's cool.
So I've got two big loves here in this city, and we're sitting in one of them. I love the Columbia Museum of Art. It's absolutely special to me for very similar reasons, really. And of course, Richland Library.
We have that in common. I think the Columbia Museum of Art and Richland Library are two of the best gems in this town.
Yeah.
Fun fact, CMA was one of my first jobs.
Oh, yeah.
This was probably 99-ish, 2000, when we did have malls, and there was a CMA gift shop in Richland Mall, which no longer exists. And I learned how to do retail there. Anyway, but I have always loved the museum. I'm an artist. I've always been into art, and this is one of my favorite places to be still to this day. And then the library does so many things for the community. It's all community based, I think, which is the great thing.
Yeah, exactly. The CMA is more than just an art museum, and Richland Library is more than just a library.
Yeah.
Y'all do some really cool things. I mean, y'all have got so many great literary art events that take place. We had Read Freely Fest not that long ago. I know that we had the Soda City Poetry Festival.
Yeah.
We've had that now 2 years going. And then y'all bring in, great authors and stuff. I mean, really good authors y'all bring in.
Really good. I went to dinner with one last night, Elena K. Arnold, who's going to be here this weekend.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you got Patrick Bringley coming in.
Yes.
So it'll be on the 19th in November.
Yes, at 6 p.m.
And
at the
then-
main library, yes.
And then Brad Gooch.
Brad Gooch, we're looking forward to. I tried to get through Radiant before
Radiant Vision.
today, but I got almost all the way through. It was a great book, but we're looking forward to Brad Gooch. He'll be here on the 25th
Yeah.
at Richland Library, Maine, at 3 o'clock.
So
Shameless plug.
Right, exactly. But no, but that's fine. I mean, so what's wild is that we've got literary arts at the Columbia Museum of Art, and we've got art at Richland Library.
Yeah.
I mean, this wonderful sort of cross-pollination and really a joining, if you will, of two very important pillars to this city. We're here specifically talking about something that you're curating there and sort of working in here a sister exhibition, if you will, for the Keith Haring show that we're doing, Art of Being Visible, I believe is what you're calling it.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So the Art of Being Visible it's the third edition of the Art of Being series. And in general, the Art of Being series is about the human experience. Our libraries are all about community and helping and supporting. And I wanted to do a series that I curated myself with a group show of local artists that could express themselves in different ways. The first edition was the Art of Being Woman.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all female poets and visual artists and just the female experience and what that meant. And it's open-ended to what that is interpreted as by each artist. The second version was the Art of Being at Peace. And that was when the Ukraine-Russia war broke out and there was a lot of unrest. So I wanted people to be able to express how it feels to be in the middle of all that. So we had Ukrainian artists, Russian artists, and American artists contribute to that show. So this third edition, the Art of Being Visible, we invited people from the LGBTQ plus community to submit, but just it's about what it means to be your authentic self and the struggle that you may face getting to that point in your life, vulnerability, having your skeleton sort of on the outside all the time and feeling like you're scared, but you have to put yourself out there. And each artist told a story. There's a story that you can read with each piece of art. And I think the purpose of the series, this one and the series as a whole, is empathy. Like people that walk through what's different between, say, the CMA and our space is that you can walk in the library whether you want to see art or not, and you're going to sort of happen upon art, which could hopefully is a great experience.
Sure.
But maybe you're walking through and you stop and you weren't expecting to see this story of this person who has faced so many challenges. And you read their story and you see their art, and now you've learned something new and you weren't even expecting it. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to curate stuff like this and have these ideas. But it's my kind of self-expression outlet to have people be able to come in and have these experiences, whether they like it or not. I'm just kidding. But sometimes, unexpectedly.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, it is for everybody, but it's going to speak differently to everybody, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the group of artists that we do have. I mean, so it's a very diverse group.
It is a diverse group. We've got mostly two-dimensional artists, but we've got one installation artist, Shabnam Miri, who has built a room, I guess you could call it, out of netting, and she's stitched these faces, these line drawing faces on the nets, and you walk in and through the faces that you see. You stand in front of them and you're, inches away from these line drawings that are hand stitched. But they're all in different stages of smiling and laughing and connectivity. They're in pairs. But when you walk through it, you're just kind of face to face with these faces. But it's large and it takes up the whole front corner of the gallery. So that's cool. Something to sort of immerse yourself into. We've got several sculptural pieces, one by someone who did a ceramics piece and she's never shown before.
Wow.
And she was real glad for the opportunity. We've had, I think, 3 out of these 15-ish artists who had never shown before.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it's a really great feeling when they email you and they're like, I was at the opening and it just felt so great and I can't wait to do this again. Thanks for the opportunity. It makes my heart sing.
Sure,
makes
yeah.
my heart warm. And then poetry too. So artists like Shannon Ivy is represented. Evelyn Berry has 2 poems in there, just about their experience, their life experience.
Sure.
It's a really full, diverse show.
Both those two are wonderful.
For sure.
So yeah, and I love there is, you're creating space for the emerging artist. I mean, that's such a hard thing to break through or overcome, and to have the space, to have the encouragement, to have the safe place. I would imagine what would be a big deterrent for someone to show their work for the first time is that, they're showing it to a group that may be expecting more established or people who come from a certain school or understand a certain way of the canon. And by giving the space for these emerging artists to come in and display and show their work, it really brings back to the essence of what art is, right? I mean, it doesn't have these other titles and stuff on there. That's the Academy. They put those titles on everything. Art is art, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what the library is welcoming, and there's nothing really elite or scary about it.
Right.
Not to say that museums are scary, or I should say galleries are scary, but they are to someone like me or someone else who hasn't shown a lot in public. You think that you walk into a gallery and, like you were saying, it's just only people that are showing here are people who do this for a living, and they make tens of thousands of dollars on their paintings.
Okay.
We're not a...
I was glad you specified the paintings and not the poetry, because I'm like, that ain't happening with the poetry.
It's different.
Just saying.
The library is not like that, and I think people know that it's a community place, and it's an easy place to walk into and say, hey, I get it weekly. Like, people come in and see the art, and they're like, I do art. How do I get involved with this?
Do y'all have a mechanism for that? If somebody does that?
Yeah, there's we've got a whole page on our website dedicated to gallery exhibition requests and the artist in residence program and everything art stuff that we do, our public art information. richlandlibrary.com is the main website, but if you do /art after it, that'll take you to our art page.
Cool. So I think that providing that space for the young artists, for the emerging artists, and why that's so important. I mean, when I was talking earlier about, starting Split Pea Soup at the library, I started that specifically because there were no opportunities like that for me. And at that point, I was in graduate school. I'd had several poems published. I was really starting to become a poet. But I couldn't help but think how much time was wasted because there was no opportunities. We didn't have a poet come to our school and be like, all right, y'all, take out a piece of paper and let's write poems. There weren't journals that were like, helping young people, try to get a poem published or work on a story or anything like that. So I know all too well that sort of transformative power, right, that takes place, and wish that I could have done that earlier. And so being able to provide something like that was kind of my way of giving back. And I think, it's neat because it kind of ties in a little bit to what Haring's doing, or was doing, wanting to do, I should say, and getting young artists more involved and getting young people more involved in art and creating art and seeing that they can create. And I think that's the big thing, right, is to be able to see that you can create, and that you're providing a space for that creation is really where it all kind of comes together. And I promise this isn't a long ramble, but my middle child, my daughter, she is a very talented visual artist. But when she was in middle school, she was doing some pretty funky stuff with garbage, like literal garbage. Like, I wasn't saying her artwork is garbage. Morgan, if you're listening to this, I'm not saying your artwork is garbage. She was doing some pretty wild things, like she would take cans and redo them, put paper on, redecorate them, doing all kinds of various, creating mobiles out of them and stuff. And I would always look at them like, oh man, those are really cool. But all she would see is, mom and dad, of course you think my stuff is cool. But when an art teacher says, that looks really cool, can I hang that up in my room? And then so all her friends see all of that. And they're like, you did that? That's really cool. And so there was this moment of affirmation, of growth, all these things that I literally from that tiny little moment saw a transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I could go on forever and talk about that, but that's a special and such a really cool thing that y'all are doing.
It's it's affirmation, and people come to me all the time and say how special it was for them to be on display like that in such a prominent place. We have something called our community gallery, which is a smaller gallery on the other side of the wall, and I reserve that for maybe not quite like a more established show, but for anybody in the community. And that is where we've hosted whole solo shows of young folks.
Mm-hmm.
Every year we've been doing the National Art Education Association state winners, who are all like K-12, like better at art than I will ever be. But they invite their parents and their families, and they come and they have a reception, and it's just a great time. There was another young lady named Yasmin who had like probably 50 people come to this tiny little space, and that was her first show, and she's gone on to like sell work. Like she's really good, actually.
Yeah.
But she was like 16 at the time. But I want to go back to Keith Haring. I was obsessed with Keith Haring when I was young, and it was because of how accessible his art was.
Mm-hmm.
It was how I could do that. Like,
yeah.
I didn't become like Keith Haring. But all of my doodles in middle school and high school were his little guys, because I could do it, and it made me feel like it wasn't something that I couldn't do. And I think a lot of people appreciate that about Keith Haring. There's a quote, art is nothing if you don't reach every segment of the people. So I think that's why it was so great for us to partner on this, because his art is accessible. Access freely is our tagline,
Exactly.
It's about community. It's about bringing the people together. It's about street art and just being out there doing the thing, and not, being holed up in your studio trying to be the, Michelangelo of everything, when you just want to make art. You just want to draw stuff.
Right.
That's what I loved about him. He was socially conscious. It's just, yeah.
But I love that, though, what you just said. Because you see this a lot of times. I think it's a mistake that sometimes, young artists, young writers will see the greatness of other artists and other writers, like, oh, I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to be that thing. I'm going to be that person. And that's sometimes a long road, sometimes
it's
a very
daunting.
lucky road, and that's not necessarily what makes one an artist or a writer.
Yeah.
It's the ability to be able to just create art, to write. And, I think doing all of that is an important message to get out. But again, having the space to be able to show that. And, I think that gets to the true mission of it. We were talking earlier about the fact that, people may not know Keith Haring's name, but they've seen his work.
For sure, yeah.
And as you're imitating it in your doodles, I was probably not imitating his work, but was probably doing very similar things with lyrics and things like that, that I would hear. And it was a feeling of, maybe I can do this. And that connection is powerful. It is something that when an artist is wanting to connect to an audience, for me, I think that's really what they're talking about. To get an audience to come in and kind of understand what they're saying is great, and there's an appreciation. But when you are practicing and participating and connecting, that's a different level, man.
Yeah.
I don't want us to get too far off, because by the time folks are hearing this, we're going to be probably wrapping up this exhibition, because it ends, November 7th? So folks really are going to need to, when they hear this, they need to stop what they're doing, jump in their car, get over to the Richland Library, and check this out before it closes. There will be others, I know, but this one sounds special, and I know I'm going to go over there and check it out.
I hope so.
No, definitely. Is there any words of encouragement that you can entice any of our listeners to? Anything particular other than the installation piece? Anything particular, like to come out, You got to see this, y'all.
Yeah, I think the most special thing about this show is the text that you read that goes with everything. There's a lot about people finding their authentic self through their art process and being able to put their art out in a place like the library or a gallery or wherever it might be, gives them purpose. And it shows that people can learn their stories and people can learn how to be empathetic to people that aren't necessarily like them or who are actually a lot like them.
Right.
And now they know.
Yep.
You know?
Yep.
Belonging is a big theme in a lot of these stories that people are talking about. Lena Garcia is one of the artists, and in her statement, she says, "We are here and we belong." And I love that. That's kind of what this gallery space is for anybody to be able to come and just say, I'm a part of this community, and so are you.
Ashley Warthen is the arts librarian at Richland Library. Their exhibition, The Art of Being Visible, is on view for just a few more weeks at their main location, located at the intersection of Hampton and Assembly Street. So, if you're stopping by the museum to come see Haring, be sure to walk across the street to the library after and check out this exhibition before it closes on November 7th. I think it's a shame that sometimes folks think that art has to be full of complexities. Art in its very nature is going to be complex, not complicated, but complex. But the mission of the art and of the artist is to simplify that complexity. Sometimes it's to concretize the abstract. Sometimes it's to find the most simple image that one can find or symbol that one can find that represents so many other complicated and complex ideas. And there are times where you see it in art or you see it in poetry where it may come across as simple, but let me warn you folks, it's not simple. It's a deceptive simplicity. It may look simple on the surface, and that's okay. All right, if that's all you got from it and you saw that and you thought, wow, that was cool, great. But I guarantee you, if you take the time and dig just a little bit deeper, you're going to see that there were reasons, that there were moves, that there were things that the artist intentionally was doing so that they could try to capture an essence or grab as much as they possibly could and boil it down and contain it down into something digestible, something to hold, something to carry. And life is full of complexities. There's nothing wrong with seeing art as something simple, as something easy, as something accessible. And that's all I'm going to say about that. You've been listening to Binder, a production of the Columbia Museum of Art, hosted by me, Ray McManus, production and editing by Drew Barron, special assistance from Joel Ryan Cook. For more information about Binder or CMA exhibitions and programs, visit our website at columbiamuseum.org.
Okay, let's try this.
Silence? Let's try silence.
Yeah, isn't it nice?
That's really great.
Yeah. If I just stop, what if I just stayed there for an hour? Would you just sit there?
Just keep it the last 5 minutes, just dead silence. and then I'll just come at the end and go, "You're welcome."
Finally, what you've all been asking.
Finally, what you've all been asking.